More people are getting fully vaccinated, and there are questions about what you can and can't do after. Carrie asked us about the new CDC guidance. She asked, is it safe to not wear a mask, social distance, or quarantine for 14 days, even if I get the vaccine? Can you talk to me about the new CDC guidance for vaccinated people? Well, we took that question straight to Dr. Syed Hussein of Trinity Health of New England.
Yes, you still have to mask up, distance, practice public health measures. There are two circumstances that the CDC released new updated guidance on those individuals that are now fully vaccinated that was released. And the first scenario is fully vaccinated people. And by that, I mean those individuals that have received the second dose, and it's been 2 weeks or greater for the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. And if it's the Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine, then it's the first and only dose, and it's been 2 weeks or greater after they've received the dose. Those individuals may choose to not wear masks or distance when they're in the company indoors of other fully vaccinated people. The second scenario is fully vaccinated individuals may choose not to wear a mask or distance with individuals who are unvaccinated living in the same household but low risk for COVID-19 disease. So there are only two exceptions to that rule of masking and distancing, which folks need to be aware of. The other thing is, if an individual is exposed to someone with COVID-19 disease and they remain asymptomatic, but they're fully vaccinated, they may forego quarantine and testing.
Carrie, thanks for your question. If you have any questions about COVID-19 or the vaccine, just send it to us. Email is share61@fox61.com. You can always text us as well. It's 860-527-6161.